Okay, so it's time to start the application process. So we are now in step 4B. Keep in mind that steps, that some general things that I talk about here with respect to step 4B and assessing your intellectual courage in this class. Some general things that I say apply to the other steps in assessing yourself in terms of intellectual empathy and intellectual perseverance. Which is why it's going to take you longest to work through step 4, because I cover a lot of stuff that bleeds over into the other steps. So right now you are following a lecture and coaching video that provides missing information, warnings, and tips. Give me just a second here. Remember to take detailed notes if you think you might plan or ask me for help. So you're going to write one coherent, compelling paragraph of at least 150 words. Said paragraph should clearly, accurately, precisely explain how you have or have not manifested intellectual courage in the context of this particular ethics course. So two things are so important here, several things actually. So I say at least 150 words. I don't know that if you use the write submission option when submitting your response, it does a word count. So you might need to use Microsoft Word, and then you can do a word count check. If you don't know how to do that, you could probably Google how do I do a word count of a Microsoft Word document, and that'll tell you how many words you have. Now, I'm not giving you a number because I like the number 150. This is meant to give you a minimum in terms of being precise and thorough and sufficient and clear. In other words, you want to think and discuss and explain and support what you have to say about your manifesting intellectual courage or not manifesting it, or only somewhat manifesting it, or only sometimes manifesting it. You want to think through it at least that much, okay? So that's what I want you to realize with that. Notice that I say a paragraph. So I want one paragraph. So no matter how many parts or moves I want you to make that I go over in your response, there should only be one paragraph. And I emphasize this because in previous assignments where I have you construct arguments, I've told people to state their conclusion and then their reasoning in one coherent paragraph because it's one argument. The entire thing's an argument, and I've gotten people, or I've said to embed the definition or include the definition as the first or second sentence in an argument or an explanation, and some people would still, despite me saying that, would still have their definition or their conclusion away from the explanation or the supporting premises. So make sure everything is all in one paragraph. The other thing is make sure that you're focused on intellectual courage and no other intellectual virtue. Again, you might decide to focus on how you manifested it, how you did not manifested it, how you sometimes manifested it, and just as importantly, sometimes students really mess up on this part in versions of this that I've done before, is making sure that you pay attention to the context in which you're to apply the definition and bullet points with respect to the particular intellectual virtue that is the focus of your writing and thinking in a given moment. So the context here, right, is this particular ethics course. So as I said in another video, the objective is to assess yourself in terms of your own character, what you have brought to the class, your disposition, your attitudes, your mindset, and your feelings, which of course resulted in behaviors and actions or inactions, and how that influenced your ability to or willingness to pursue and ability to attain and accomplish intellectual objectives, learning objectives, knowledge objectives that I had for you in virtue of doing various assignments and whatnot. So make sure that when you're when you're discussing things and you're giving me examples of when you did or did not reflect intellectual courage, that the examples come from this particular ethics course. Okay, so now we're going to get into more detail, and this is going to include some tips and as well as some warnings with respect to this. And so what I said here generally applies to steps 5 and 6 as well. It's just that for steps 5 and 6, you'll also have 150 words. The context is this particular ethics course. However, for step 5, you'll be talking about intellectual empathy, and in step 6, you'll be talking about intellectual perseverance. Therefore, I'm not going to repeat what the insights that I gave you here in step 4 when we get to steps 5 and B. I will read through this part again, but I'm not going to lecture on what this is saying. Okay, so now what you generally do here for step 4, and intellectual courage, you generally do for step 5 and intellectual empathy, for step 6 and intellectual perseverance. So let's go ahead using intellectual courage as our case in point, right, to see what are the intellectual moves that I want you to make. So if you look at the rubrics that I've used to score your essay or your topic response to a discussion board or even a peer response, one of the major rows that I have in the rubric has to do with attentiveness, intellectual attentiveness, right? That has to do with following the instructions and working through the process as outlined in the instructions. So here then, I am telling you what intellectual moves I want you to make in applying the concept of intellectual courage, an intellectual virtue concept. And I'm telling you the order in which I want you to make those intellectual moves. By following the outline, you are getting a kind of template or method for making intellectual moves like a philosopher, where you're analyzing yourself with philosophical concepts. So that is a component. Did you make the intellectual moves requested per the instructions? That's part of what intellectual attentiveness is getting to in the rubric. Okay, so in your paragraph, the very first thing you're going to do is introduce the official definition for step 4, intellectual courage. In step 5, intellectual empathy. Step 6, intellectual perseverance. This says the video linked above has a lot of additional information I should see applied. You are now listening to said video. So the very first sentence should introduce the main definition for intellectual courage. So, of course, you're going to go to the PowerPoint and you're going to find the slide that you need to work on. So this would be slide 4 from your download that you should have gotten from another step. And the main definition is always going to be at the top of the slide, and you're going to see it in bold, and you'll see the words main definition. So it's this part. Anything that's below the bolded words main definition and the phrase immediately after that, these are additional points that you should be bringing into your conversation, but you start off with just the definition. So to iterate, as I've iterated in the Aristotle lectures and instruction, and as I've iterated in argument construction examples and other assignments, you can't just plop a quotation mark. So you can't just start quotation mark, awareness of the need and ability to face and express ideas. First of all, that would be a sentence fragment. You have to introduce the quote. And so I think if you go to step 3 in the folder, step 3 of this assignment, I think it was step 3, that's where I tell you how to do your internal citations or how to cite where you're getting information from. So, you can say as Dr. A states, or as Dr. C states, or as noted on slide 4, comma, and then I want you to copy verbatim the main definition, put it in quotation marks. So I want all of the words, each and every single word from the main definition. And it needs to be in quotation marks. If not, you're going to get a 0 for the entire assignment, because by now we should be well aware of, people say, I already know how to write an essay, I already know about plagiarism, and yet students commit it all the time. So I have to emphasize this time and again. So, of course, the main definition for intellectual empathy is right here, and then the main definition for intellectual perseverance is right here. So as you can see, we're hitting several steps at once. Okay, so your very first sentence is going to have some kind of phrase that introduces the definition, has quotation marks, follows step 3 in using internal citations to say where you're getting this definition from. That's the very first sentence in your paragraph, is introducing the definition for the concept with which you're working. So for step 4, I'm going to see in your submission that you introduce the official definition for intellectual courage from slide 4 of the PowerPoint. Then, since we're writing one coherent, compelling paragraph, in that same paragraph, in other words, this starts off your paragraph. It's like you're introducing the topic. This is where you apply the words and phrases in the definition that you quoted. You carefully connect your identified thinking, learning moment or categories of thinking, or I could say moments, to the definition you just quoted. So I said, notice what I said, connect. You're actually applying the definition to examples or counter examples, to scenarios or counter scenarios. So it's not that you're connecting, it's not that you're applying examples to the definition. No, you're applying the definition to examples, but some people, they don't really understand what connect means. So connect doesn't mean that you're applying A to B. It just means that you're showing how they're connected. So you're going to show me how an example is connected to a definition. But another way to think about this is that you're showing how the definition you just quoted, how B applies to some example, set of examples, scenarios, counter examples, counter scenarios to A. All right. So what you're going to do is, and I'm going to provide a lot of information, so you need to take a lot of notes here. You're going to describe the task or category of task that you're going to focus on, what it called for, the point of the task, the steps, the content, etc. Use a lot of details. Pretend I don't know anything about the task you are referencing. Be exact. Okay, so let's focus on that part. So how do you decide what to focus on? Well, you have to definitely review the lesson on intellectual courage. So you're going to be thinking about that definition, of course, that you have, and then you'll want to carefully review dimensions 1 and 2. Maybe one of these speaks to you more. I'm not saying you have to cover both of them, but you should at least, you might want to focus on just one of them. And then you'll want to look at the sub-bullets. So don't just go by like the general description of dimension 1 or the general description of dimension 2. Make sure you take a really close look at the sub-bullets, because the sub-bullets are going to help you identify what it is that you want to apply the definition of an intellectual virtue concept to. So in terms of this class, I'm going to give you a list of things that you can use from the class to discuss some dimension of expressing intellectual courage. So write these down. So when it comes to dimension 1, being conscious of the need to face and fairly address towards ideas towards which one has strong negative emotions or feelings. And notice here that I say about which he or she has fear, anxiety, insecurity, or apprehension. You should definitely look up these terms, especially apprehension, and make sure you're looking up these definitions in a way that is contextually sensitive. In other words, there will be lots of definitions for these words, but they won't all equally apply or be as equally relevant, and hence won't be as equally compelling in talking about a time when you reflected or failed to reflect dimension 1 of intellectual courage. I really encourage you to use, these ideas and to look at the different definitions and think about which ones are most useful, in terms of coming up with examples or counter examples of this. And you could even define these terms. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and let you know that you could use, I'm giving you permission to use a dictionary, but you have to cite the dictionary and include the URL at the end of your discussion in a works cited list. You can provide definitions for these words, but make sure you quote the definition no matter how short the definition is. Do not paraphrase it. Okay, so this is really important. So think about this. Here's a list of things that you could use for this. So think about the readings. Think about different theories that you learned about. Were there any theories that might have opposed your own moral theory about how you decide right or wrong? Did any of the theories like utilitarianism, duty ethics or content ethics, virtue ethics, social contract theory, did natural law theory, did any of these theories oppose your own view about how you should decide right or wrong, or how to decide how you should be a good or bad person? Did any of them question the moral principles or rules or values that you live by? Did any of the theories challenge your own way of thinking about morality, about right and wrong, good or bad, or evil? So there's the reading. So then if you want to do this, you can, but you need to make sure that you tell me which readings and then which ideas. In which way did the theory, or what was it in the theory that caused you some kind of fear or apprehension or insecurity or anxiety? What claim in the theory questioned or opposed or challenged what idea or presupposition or assumption you had about right or wrong. Now, if you wanted to, you could focus on, the applied chapters. So, for example, you read about genetic enhancement, right? Genetic enhancement. So then you could say, well, this really challenged this. What I read in the debate about, genetic enhancement, I found that a lot of my own views about right and wrong, maybe about how you decide right and wrong, or maybe even the issue itself, genetic enhancement, maybe you found that some of the ideas expressed in an applied reading like that one opposed or questioned or challenged your own view. Now, the idea is that the view that you are encountering or about to encounter somehow opposes, questions, challenges, we could even say undermines your own view. You have a sense that it will, which engenders fear or anxiety or insecurity or apprehension. So make sure that you're thinking of those things in an interrelated way. So again, when your discussion, you could focus on one reading and just go in depth about that. Make sure that if you're doing that, make sure that you pull from words in the main definition that you cite. Make sure you pull from words and phrases in here. Make sure you pull from words and phrases in here. You are to, let's go ahead and look at, since we're getting to it, look at what it says here. Directly and explicitly embed words from the definition, the one that you cite as your first sentence, okay, and the bullet points below the definition. So what do I mean by that? So the main definition, and then these are bullet points. So let's say you're focusing on dimension 1, maybe some ideas you came across in the reading, whether it was about the theories or the applied contemporary moral problems. I should see words and word phrases from here, and here, explicitly, directly, obviously, embedded, and tightly interwoven, right, into your development of a very detailed example or set of examples of how you manifested or failed to manifest intellectual courage in completing the learning, thinking task or categories of a task. So let's get back to that. Okay, so when it comes to dimension 1, and I'm just using that as an example, I said that you can use the readings, you can focus on theories, you can focus on applied problems. You could speak generally in one way. So you could say, when it came to the readings, I reflected intellectual courage most of the time or some of the time. So you quote the definition, and then you can give a broad statement like, do you think you reflected it throughout all the readings, only throughout some of the readings? Which readings challenged you with respect to your intellectual courage the most? Which one do you think you did I think I would stop there. So which ones do you think, which readings, what was the topic, what was the claim, or whatnot? So then you can pick a couple of examples. You can say I've reflected it most of the time, but maybe 2 times I didn't. For example, in this reading it said this, and it questioned this belief that I had, or whatnot. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say about that. Okay, so that's all I have about the readings. Now, another category of assignments that you could focus on is the discussion boards. So what you could do is go through the syllabus, the course schedule, and remind yourself of the discussion boards that we did. What was the general topic, and then you can try to remember what the topics were about. So remember, there was a discussion board topic where you had to tell me whether or not you would run through some protesters to get a life-saving vaccine to some children. And then you had to read through peer responses to see what they had to say. And then I had another scenario about Roberta, who was caught on video smashing some windows of a shop owner who was killed, and whether or not you would turn her into the police. And then, of course, we read about the looting and the protesting, and I had you construct some responses that I then turned into discussion boards about Barry McCary and whether he should tolerate looting. And then I also turned in another response from that article into a discussion board about whether the people who looted that Target were depraved, whether they exhibited depravity. So what I'm getting at with all this in terms of intellectual courage dimension 1, okay, is that you had to encounter the ideas. You had to face and fairly address ideas in the discussion boards. So whose ideas were they? They were the ideas of your peers. Now, if you're reading something that a peer has to say that completely agrees with you, that's not intellectual courage. Because if somebody completely agrees with you, then you're not experiencing negative emotions or feelings. There is no fear, anxiety, insecurity, or apprehension. Now, that said, you could talk about whether or not you began to feel any fear, anxiety, insecurity, apprehension, or ickiness, like as you were prompted to go and read the peer thread. So at that moment when I said, okay, read these peer threads, did you feel any of that? Were you concerned about, ideas that would oppose, question, or challenge your own? Did you start to have strong negative emotions that could be categorized as one of these? So notice that when I'm talking about negative emotions and feelings for intellectual courage, I'm talking about these kinds of emotions right here relative to having this kind of experience with respect to your own ideas about something. So I'm basically saying that you can talk about your ability to reflect intellectual courage or not reflect intellectual courage when encountering ideas from your peers in the discussion boards and responding to your peers' ideas. Okay, so especially if, when you read peers whose conclusions or ideas opposed your own. Now, another option, and this is going to be the final option for Dimension 1, and that is that if you were in class Thursday or Friday of week 13, and you were able to participate and granted permission to participate in the live student sharing of a response for one of the discussion boards for our last unit on looting and protesting, if you were one of the students that had one of those forms and you read your response to a peer and then you listened to your peer read a response and then you discussed how your views compare and contrast, you can also use that experience if you want to just focus on one experience. So I don't know if you've been able to tell or not, but you can talk about your ability to reflect intellectual courage throughout the semester, okay? And then you can focus on a category of experiences. So like when I did the readings, or when I was reading the theories, or when I was reading about the contemporary moral problems, or when I was reading about the theories and the contemporary moral problems, or you can focus on discussion boards and when you were prompted to read peer threads, as you began to read peer threads, you can talk about that generally, but you still have to give specifics, from particular assignments, reading assignments, or from particular discussion boards. If it's the discussion boards, you'll have to remember, well, what were some of the things that your peers said? Did you say, that the people who looted the Target store were depraved, but you didn't think they were depraved, and upon reading it, you thought, man, what are they going to say that's going to question me, So you still have to pull specifics, even if you're talking generally about your ability to reflect intellectual courage while doing certain kinds of assignments as a whole. And you might say, I reflected a lot of intellectual courage in this reading, but not while doing this reading. Or I reflected a lot of intellectual courage when, answering peer threads about this topic, but not so much this topic. But like I was saying, if you were in class, you can also talk about, the times, the 2 times that you listened to a peer express his or her own views. Now, of course, you did do that for a grade, and that was part of the extra credit in class assignment. So this applies only to people who came to class and actually did the extra credit assignment. Still, think about this. If you had such a high level of fear, anxiety, insecurity, or apprehension, if you had those to a really high extent about the ideas that you were about to face or were being asked to face, you could have shut down and just said, I refuse to do this. If you let any of these emotions get over you, right? You could have left class. You could have broken down and just said, I can't do it. I'm too scared. But you didn't. So even if you listen to your views, read their responses to you, you overcame whatever fears, anxieties, insecurities, or apprehensions you might have. And you did listen to your peer. And how do we know that? Because you discussed how your views compared and contrasted. And that in and of itself probably took intellectual courage as well, right? Because you were putting your views out there for discussion in terms of how they compare to your peers live. And it's interesting to think about whether you need more intellectual courage to respond to, to interact with and learn about a peer's view. Does it take more intellectual courage for you for that than it does just reading a peer response? So again, if you do this, if you use, that specific example of being in class the Thursday or Friday of week 13, do make sure, as I've highlighted with the other examples or scenarios or ways of handling this prompt, make sure that you give specifics. So, the first peer, did that peer have a view or ideas that opposed, questioned, or challenged your own in some way? Were you concerned that they would? Did you have any fears or anxieties in, listening to their views? What else do I want to say? I think that's all. So that's dimension 1 of intellectual courage. Let's hit quickly on dimension 2 so that we can wrap up this video. So being conscious of the need to express one's ideas, even if those ideas are in the minority or question an established way of thinking. So there's really not that many instances or ways to get at dimension 2. So most of you will want to focus on the main definition in dimension 1 and not the main dimension in dimension 2. So that's about expressing your own ideas. However, you could talk generally